Hello and welcome back on my retro computer channel. I am back with another personal story from 1995. In my last video, I talked about how I built my first PC in 93. It was a 386SX, and in this video, I'll talk about how I improved it further to a speedy 486DX2 machine. Intel introduced the Pentium CPUs in 93. So when I had this computer, it was really behind the schedule. But it is interesting what made possible to make a very big jump from the 386SX to a 486DX2. Originally, Intel introduced the 486 CPUs in 1989. Intel developed step by step this CPU further. So first they started to increase the clock speed from the original 25 MHz, they increased it to 33 MHz, and then later on they split it to two different products. The aim was to have a cheaper version which could replace the 386DX CPUs. The difference between the full-fledged 486DX and the SX is very simple. The SX lacks the floating point unit. In 1992 they introduced the 50 MHz version of the DX, but it had a problem. They hit the wall with the increase of the frontside bus speed. It caused instability. The solution was very simple. They introduced the 486DX2. This CPU simply doubles the external clock speed, so if it is 33 MHz, the internal part is running on 66. As you can see, I have an overdrive, but in fact, this is just a simple DX2. They also produced the 487, which was marketed as kind of floating point unit, so a coprocessor for the SX, but in fact it was also a full-fledged 486DX. Finally in 94, Intel introduced the DX4. In fact, it should be DX3 because it is running inside 3 times higher than the external clock speed. You may wonder why they introduced this CPU when they had the Pentium. The reason is very simple. They aimed with this 486DX4 the lower market, while the Pentium was the high end. Of course, there were alternatives. AMD introduced its own variant in April 1993, and in the next year they also introduced the clock-doubled versions, so the SX2 and the DX2. They also followed Intel with the DX4 in 95, and later on, because they had problems with their own Pentium class CPUs, they introduced the 5x86, which was the real 486DX4. In fact, the 586 was an enhanced 486 CPU with a multiplier of 4. It was running on 133 MHz, but it was very common to overclock it to 160 MHz. It was the first CPU with a PR rating, so it was compared to a Pentium running on 75 MHz. Cyrix also designed their own 486 compatible CPUs. They started to ship somewhere in mid-93. They introduced the DX2 versions in September 1993. Their DX4 variant arrived somewhere in 95. It was a little bit late compared to the Intel and AMD versions, but also price-wise, it was very competitive. I would like to mention their 5x86 variant. It was pin compatible with the 486 motherboards, but its internal design arrived from their Pentium class CPUs. You may wonder why I'm talking about Cyrix CPU, why I have a very nice Texas Instruments one. The reason is very simple. Cyrix was a fabless design company. Texas Instruments, SGS Thomson, and IBM produced their chips. So if you find a 486 labeled as, for example, ST or IBM, you also have Cyrix inside. There is one more company, UMC. They also designed their own 486 variant, but unfortunately Intel sued them. So Intel played again this dirty game, and because of that, UMC left the CPU market. I will test this CPU as well, but I cannot compare it directly with the others because it is soldered on the motherboard. So this is a fake chip motherboard without VLB. There is no bezel local bus. It makes me very hard to compare them in a fair way. Until now, I haven't mentioned that But on top of the different variants, so DX, DX4, SX, whatsoever, there was an additional differentiator between the CPUs. The older variants used 5V as supply voltage, while the newer ones required something around 3.3 volts. It made it impossible to use a new DX4 in an old motherboard. Of course, there was a solution for that. Intel provided an overdrive CPU, as well as external companies had their own solutions. I had this Kingston Turbo chip, which is using an AM5X86, and it can be inserted into an older motherboard. And this is where my story starts. So I had the 386SX, and I got a motherboard with 486 DLC. It was a big jump because it was somewhere around 60% faster, but luckily the motherboard had an additional socket for 486 CPUs. I sold the old 386 motherboard and I started the hunt for a 486DX. It had to be a 5V variant, so either 486DX or DX2. It was very hard to find such CPU, but I had luck. At the end, I bought a Texas Instruments, so Cyrix DX280. Of course, I had nothing to lose, so I tried to overclock it. The overclock was partially successful. It was not stable at 100 MHz. But I did not give it up, so I bought a Peltier to improve the cooling, and it worked out. After the successful overclock, I had a CPU running on 100 MHz. It was very cool, but the benchmarks were really disappointing. I had to realize that the Trident 8900 was a bottleneck. Because of that, I looked for a VesaLocal bus video card. But these cards were not designed to run on 50 MHz without a wait state. A friend of mine worked for a second-hand computer shop, so we started to swap the cards one by one. Finally, we found one which was able to run on the speed without wait state. But as soon as we installed a second card, a Super I/O card, into the other VesaLocal bus slot, the computer became unstable. We swapped cards for another half a day, and finally we ended with a single VesaLocal bus video card, and an ISOBus I/O card for the hard drive, and an additional card with serial and parallel ports. I do not say it was the best solution, but it worked. This setup with 8 MB of memory was able to run most of the games that time. I was very happy until Quake was introduced in 1996, but I think it is another story. In the meantime, you can see how I'm building on the bench the current setup. It is very similar to what I had, but this motherboard sports PCI and VesaLocal bus slots as well. This is not the fastest motherboard I have, but this is quite stable and very easy to handle. This is one reason why I'm using this motherboard. The other one is Soyo made it very stable. It helps me to proceed faster with the benchmarks. I keep the system and the sound card from the previous build, but increase the memory to 32 MB. It won't increase the results, so it keeps it comparable, but at least I have enough memory if I would like to install Windows 95 later on. I also have a cheap PCI based video card. This is an S3 Verge, and I plan to compare it with the older S3 805. After the hardware, let's check out the benchmark results. As usual, I have more data than I can explain briefly, but what I can do is share all the results and then have a quick conclusion. First of all, let's compare the ISA, the PCI, and the VesaLocal bus video cards. I have many results. It is interesting to see that the VesaLocal bus is faster than the PCI. I do not know the exact reason behind. I can just guess, and my guess is that there is no wait state on the VesaLocal bus, while the PCI has some timing issues, but to be honest, the difference is not too big, so they are on the same level. If we compare the ISA to the VesaLocal bus, then there is a very interesting tendency. The theoretical data transfer speed of the VesaLocal bus at least should be 4 times or even more times faster than the old ISA bus. This theoretical difference is not reflected by the test, but under 3D Bench and Wolfenstein, the card with VesoLocal bus interface is at least 2 times faster, but as we are swapping the CPU to a faster one, the difference is also increasing. It is far from linear, but as I'm swapping the 33 MHz variant to a 100 MHz variant, the difference increasing from 2-fold to around 3-fold. But I find Doom much more interesting. The difference between the two cards with the slowest CPU is just 37%. But with the DX4, this difference is increasing a lot. I think the reason behind is CPU limit, so a slower CPU is not fast enough to utilize all the bandwidth and all the possibilities from the VLB card. I could see similar pattern in my previous video with the 486 DLC, so it is not a surprise, just reflecting the previous one. After the video card interfaces, let's compare the different CPU makers. As you can see, I run on different clock speed the different CPUs. It makes it possible to compare them not just frequency-wise. So for example, if a CPU costs $100 and another one costs the same amount of money, I can judge which one was faster. I also used a lot of different benchmarks, but finally I just used a subset to make a chart. I did that because the synthetic benchmarks are misleading several times. So at the end I'm just using the compression, so RAR, and the 3 FPS, so Wolfenstein, Doom and Quake results. The slowest CPU was the Cyrix 486DX running at 25 MHz, and because of that I'm using it as a reference. If I may group the results, I would like to make 3 different groups. The first group is the below 200%. Mainly these are the CPUs running under 50 MHz. The second group is for the DX2s, and the last group is the DX4s and the 5x86. It is interesting to see that the SX CPUs are not slower than the DX CPUs. The reason behind is very simple. There were just a few programs using the FPU, so it made not a big difference. My second observation is that the Cyrix CPUs are underperforming a little bit. There is no big difference between the Intel and AMD variants, but Cyrix is most of the cases somewhere between a faster and a slower CPU. So for example, the Cyrix made DX2 CPU running at 66 MHz is just between the 50 and 66 MHz Intel variants. Most of the cases the AMD CPUs are also slower than the Intel CPUs, but the difference is not that big, so I can say there is just a few % between those CPUs. I would like to mention one more thing, and this is the frequency scaling. Since the newer CPUs are using multipliers, the frontside bus speed is not jumping. So for example, if we have a 486SX running on 33 MHz, it has the same memory bandwidth as a DX2 running at 66 MHz or a DX4 running at 100 MHz. Also, the fastest CPU in the test, which is the 5x86 running at 133 MHz, has the very same memory bandwidth. But this memory bandwidth is not enough to feed the newer CPUs. On this chart, you can see how the CPUs are scaling. So the red ones at the bottom, those are belonging to the DX2s. The theoretical light red and the real darker red are very close to each other. It means the scaling is almost perfect. For the frequency tripling DX4s, it is not true. As you can see, there is a distance between the two green lines. The light green presents the theoretical scaling, while the darker one shows the reality. The distance between the blue lines are even higher, so it means the 5x86 is not really scaling. It is still faster than the other CPUs, but it is not 2 times faster than a DX2 running at 66 MHz. I was really disappointed with these results, so I talked to others how do they see this scaling. They measured a little bit better scaling, but there were 2 differences between our benchmarks. They also included the synthetic results, and the second one was the optimization. I fine-tuned the cache settings, the bus settings whatsoever to make the CPU still stable, but as fast as possible. It means the results here may a little bit change if I skip this step, this optimization, but it won't change my final conclusion, which is very simple. If we can use a CPU with lower multiplier but faster base clock speed, it can be faster than using higher multiplier but lower front speed bus. The CPU makers were aware of this problem, so they tried to encounter it. They introduced bigger cache for the DX4s, so they increased the cache from 8 KB to 16 KB, and later on they introduced the write-back cache instead of write-through ones. I made few benchmarks with write-through and write-back cache, and to be honest, it is not really convincing. Sometimes I can measure even up to 10% advantage, and sometimes the write-through is the faster one. The difference between is just few percent, but to be honest, it is not a real game changer. But it is funny to see advertisements from Intel where they promise 30%, which is obviously not true. The increased cache size also brings around 5% speed increase, which is not bad, of course, but similar to the write-back cache, it is not a game changer. After the hard benchmark results, let's talk about the games. At the beginning I planned 2 games, but as I started to playing around, more and more memories came back. And those memories were better than the reality. Today I also wonder how we were able to play with these games, because they are just running on few FPS, let's say 10, 12, 16, and we consider it as playable. Today we expect 60 FPS or at least 30 as a bare minimum. So come and join the joyride for the next few minutes and watch my favorite games. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time. Goodbye.
Go! Wow! Stay out of my face!
Global Defense Initiative selected. Our base is under attack.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit
Yes, sir.
lost.
Yes, sir.
Damn, those alien bastards are gonna pay for shooting up my ride. Oh.
Hello, Chauncey. And they say money doesn't grow on trees. Water it often and give it morning light. Enjoy.
Fire!